The fire had been burning for 2 hours before Lydia Monroe finally understood that no one was going to make room for her. She stood at the edge of the circle of light, a tin plate clutched in both hands, the warmth of the harvest flames pressing against her face while her back remained cold with the October night air. All around her, the families of Caldwell County, Kansas, were packed shoulder to shoulder on the split-log benches arranged in a wide horseshoe around the communal bonfire. Women in their good calico dresses laughed and passed dishes of corn pudding and smoked pork. Children darted between the grown-up legs. Men tipped their hats and called out across the flames to one another with the easy familiarity of people who had shared 20 years of drought and rain, heartbreak and harvest together. Not one of them shifted even an inch to create a gap for her. She had tried twice. The first time she approached the bench where the Harmon women always sat, Ruth Harmon had spread her skirt wide and placed a shawl over the open space with a pleasant, entirely deliberate smile. The second time, near where the Calvert brothers crowded together with their wives, young Danny Calvert had set his hat down on the empty section of plank and turned immediately back to his conversation without so much as glancing at her. It was not accidental. That was the part that burned worse than any humiliation she had felt in the 4 months since arriving in Caldwell. It was deliberate, and it was coordinated, and every single person around that fire knew exactly what they were doing. She had come to this town carrying a secret that had not stayed secret, and now the town had decided what she was worth. She was deciding whether to simply walk back to her rented room above the dry goods store and be done with the whole degrading evening when the tallest man at the fire stood up. He did not call out her name. He did not wave dramatically or make a scene. Simon Boone simply rose from his place on the far side of the bonfire, his considerable height making him visible above every other head, and he pointed. One deliberate, unhurried gesture of his right hand, indicating the spot on the bench beside him that had just been vacated when his ranch foreman, old Pete Garrett, wandered off toward the cider barrel. He pointed at the seat. And then he looked directly at Lydia Monroe across 20 feet of crackling firelight, and he did not look away. The entire circle went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something unexpected and slightly dangerous has just occurred. Lydia's heart did something complicated inside her chest. She had not asked this man for anything. She did not know him well enough to accept anything from him. But the way he was standing there, patient and utterly unmoved by the sudden hush that had fallen over Caldwell County's finest gathering of the year, made her feel something she had not felt since arriving in this flat, wind-scoured corner of Kansas. She felt, for one suspended breath, like she might be worth defending. She crossed the space between them with her chin level and her eyes steady, and she sat down beside Simon Boone, and the whole town watched her do it. That was the moment everything truly began. But to understand what it cost both of them, and what it would ultimately forge between them, you have to go back to the beginning of October 1882, to the afternoon Lydia Monroe first rode into Caldwell on the southbound stage from Wichita, carrying a carpet bag, a dress with a badly mended hem, and a past that was already running ahead of her like a shadow in late afternoon sun. The stage depot on 2nd Street smelled of horse lather and axle grease, and the September heat had not yet broken despite the calendar insisting it was fall. Lydia stepped down from the coach with the careful movements of a woman who had been traveling for 11 days and did not want to fall in front of strangers. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that the journey had done nothing to improve, and gray eyes the color of the Kansas sky just before a storm decides what it wants to be. She had a letter in the inside pocket of her coat. The letter was from a lawyer named William Hatch, and it informed her that she was the sole heir to a property on the southeastern edge of town left by her late father, Gerald Monroe, who had died of a fever in July. She had not seen her father in 9 years. She had not seen Caldwell at all until today. But the letter said there was a house and 12 acres of land, and Lydia Monroe had been in St. Louis for 3 years with nothing but a sewing position at a textile house and a small room that let in the winter wind. So 12 acres of Kansas dirt sounded like the grandest fortune on earth. The property was a source of immediate disappointment. The house her father had lived in was a 2-room soddy with a collapsed roof section and a doorway that had been so badly warped by the summer rains that it would not fully close. The 12 acres were overgrown and dry, and the well had clearly not been maintained. She stood in the doorway of the ruined house in the slanting late afternoon light and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having been disappointed many times before, that this was not a rescue. This was merely a different kind of difficulty. She spent 2 nights in the soddy with a rolled-up blanket against the broken door before she found the room above Hennessy's dry goods, which Widow Hennessy rented to her for a fair price after looking her up and down with the expression of a woman who can read another woman's circumstances at a glance and has decided to be decent about it. Caldwell in the autumn of 1882 was a cattle town that was trying to decide whether it was still a cattle town. The great Longhorn drives from Texas had been roaring through Caldwell for over a decade, making the town one of the most important rail shipping points on the southern Kansas line. But the railroad had extended further south, and the Texas ranchers were beginning to use other routes, and there was a restless, transitional feeling to the streets, as if the town was holding its breath and waiting to learn what it would become next. Into this atmosphere of suppressed anxiety arrived Lydia Monroe, and within 2 weeks, the secret that was following her caught up. She had been married before. That was the beginning of the story, and the part the town understood. She had been married at 19 to a man named Charles Aldous in St. Louis, and Charles Aldous had turned out to be dishonest in ways that started small and grew, as dishonesty tends to, until they became something that could not be ignored. He had borrowed money from men with sharp eyes and shorter patience, and when those men came looking for their investment, Charles Aldous had been gone for 3 days already, and Lydia had been left to explain to 2 very unfriendly gentlemen why the parlor where they were sitting contained only furniture and a wife who knew nothing. The marriage had been dissolved. Charles Aldous had eventually been found in Nevada with a different name and a different woman, and the legal proceedings had taken the better part of 2 years and cost Lydia nearly everything she had. She had survived it. She had gone to work at the textile house and rebuilt her circumstances, slowly and carefully, the way a person rebuilds after a flood, salvaging what can be salvaged and letting the rest go. But what the town of Caldwell heard was not that complete, dignified story. What the town of Caldwell heard passed along through the particular telegraph of small-town gossip that operated faster than any wire system the actual telegraph company could install, was that Lydia Monroe was a divorced woman from the city who had come to take possession of property that old Gerald Monroe had never properly filed the deed for, and that she might have a legal claim and she might not. But either way, she was a divorced woman, and everyone knew what kind of woman got herself divorced. It was 1882. A divorced woman was not quite respectable. A divorced woman who had arrived alone, without family or references or a husband, who had taken a room above a shop instead of going to stay with relations the way a decent woman would, was an object of suspicion at best and contempt at worst. The women of the Ladies' Aid Society of Caldwell First Baptist Church made their position clear within 3 weeks by simply never inviting her to join them. The wives of the ranching families made their position clear by acknowledging her in the street with the minimal social currency required to avoid outright rudeness, which in a small western town meant a nod instead of a smile, an exchange of weather observations instead of a conversation. The men of the town made their position clear in a way that was in some respects worse, because several of them were entirely too friendly in ways that had nothing to do with friendship. She had twice been required to end conversations at the dry goods counter with a firmness that left the men in question looking offended, as if she had no right to decline what they were offering. She had been in Caldwell for exactly 5 weeks when she first actually spoke to Simon Boone. She had, of course, seen him before that. In a town the size of Caldwell, you saw everyone. He was hard to miss in any case. Simon Boone was 32 years old and had the build of a man who had done serious physical labor since he was old enough to be useful, but he wore it differently than most of the ranching men in town. There was nothing rough or unpolished about him. He had a face that was angular and serious, with dark eyes that had the quality of measuring things before committing to a response, and he dressed well without being vain about it. His ranch, the Double B, was the largest cattle operation in Caldwell County, something over 8,000 acres running from the eastern edge of town south toward the Chicaskia River. He was also, as far as she could tell from 5 weeks of observation, the only person in this town who did not engage in the sport of publicly discussing his opinion of every other person in it. She had heard his name come up in conversations she was not meant to overhear, which was a category of conversation she had developed considerable expertise in navigating. People spoke of Simon Boone with a mixture of respect and a vague, unresolved puzzlement, as if he were a book they had read carefully and still could not quite interpret. He had taken over the Double B from his father 12 years ago, at 20, when his father had died in an accident with a poorly broken horse. He had built it into something substantial. He had a foreman named Pete Garrett who was universally liked, and a small crew of men who were universally considered reliable, which was high praise in cattle country. He was not married. This last fact was the source of considerable speculation in a county where a successful man of 32 who was not married was generally assumed to be hiding something. Lydia did not particularly care about Simon Boone's private reasons for his private choices. She was too busy fighting for her own survival to spare energy worrying about someone else's. The first time they actually spoke was on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. She had gone to see the lawyer, William Hatch, about the property deed situation, and she was leaving his office on Main Street when she misjudged the depth of the step down from the boardwalk, because she was still reading the letter Hatch had handed her. She did not fall. She staggered, caught herself on a porch post, and looked up to find Simon Boone 2 feet away, having stopped mid-stride when she lurched, with his hand raised in the instinctive motion of a person preparing to catch someone. They looked at each other for a moment. "I have it," she said, meaning the letter, meaning her balance, meaning herself. "I see that," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, careful and unhurried. "Bad news." She looked down at the letter. William Hatch had told her that 2 neighboring landowners were contesting the validity of her father's deed, claiming Gerald Monroe had never properly registered the property after purchasing it in 1875, which meant that her inheritance might dissolve into a legal dispute that could take years and money she did not have. "Complicated news," she said. She expected him to nod and move on, because that was what people in this town did with her. They moved on quickly. But Simon Boone stayed where he was, and after a brief silence he said, "Is the Hatch situation about your father's property?" She looked at him directly for the first time. It was disconcerting being looked at by someone who did not appear to be cataloging her flaws or assessing her market value. He was just looking at her, the way you look at a person you are genuinely listening to. "Yes," she said. "The Alderman brothers are the ones making the claim," he said. It was not a question. "You know about it." "This is Caldwell," he said, with an inflection that was not quite a smile but contained the bones of one. "Everyone knows about everything approximately 4 hours before it happens." Despite herself, despite every hard-won instinct she had developed over 5 weeks of navigating this town's hostility, she felt the corner of her mouth move. "Then you know whether I have a case." "I know that your father bought that land fair and made improvements on it for 7 years, he said. "And I know that the Alderman brothers have wanted that southeastern parcel since before your father bought it because there's a spring on it that feeds their eastern pasture, and I know that Frank Alderman has been creative with legal technicalities before when it served him." He paused. "You need a good survey of the property and the original bill of sale from 1875, if your father kept it." She had the bill of sale. She had found it in a tin box under the collapsed roof section when she had spent an afternoon at the Saudi going through what remained of her father's belongings. She had not known its significance until this moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it as something more than politeness, though she was careful to keep it simple. He touched the brim of his hat and moved on. She walked back to the dry goods store thinking about the quality of a person who offers useful information without attaching conditions to it. Over the following weeks, the county's legal and social machinery ground along in its usual fashion. She engaged a surveyor from Wichita, using almost the last of her savings, and delivered the original 1875 bill of sale to William Hatch, who agreed with visible relief that it significantly improved her position. The Alderman brothers, learning that their target was not as defenseless as they had assumed, began negotiating a compromise that Hatch thought she could accept. During those weeks, she crossed paths with Simon Boone several more times. In a town of 2,000 people, this was inevitable. But she noticed that unlike most of the accidental encounters she had in Caldwell, these did not leave her feeling worse than before. He did not avoid her. He did not offer her the over-careful courtesy of a man who is aware that being seen talking to her carries social risk. He spoke to her when they met, briefly and naturally, the way you speak to a neighbor, and moved on. She found herself noticing small things about him that she had not expected to notice about anyone in this place where she had arrived intending only to claim what was hers and establish herself well enough to survive. She noticed that he listened to people carefully, the kind of listening that requires actual attention rather than merely waiting for your turn to speak. She noticed that the men who worked for him on the Double B spoke about him with a particular tone, neither fearful nor sycophantic, that suggested he had earned their respect through something real. She noticed that the town's general opinion of him contained a complicated thread of resentment, as if his prosperity and his steadiness were things they could not quite decide whether to admire or be suspicious of. She found out, in the oblique way she had learned to find things out in Caldwell, that the suspicion had a source. Simon Boone had been engaged once, 3 years ago, to a woman named Clara Finch, daughter of the Finch family from the northern part of the county. The engagement had ended, and it had ended badly, and the exact nature of how it had ended was a subject on which the town had strong opinions that varied dramatically depending on who was doing the talking. Some said he had broken it off coldly and without cause, which was evidence of a heartless nature. Some said Clara had discovered something about him that could not be overlooked, which was evidence of a dark past. Some said the whole thing had been Clara's family's doing, that her father had pushed her toward a richer man from Wichita, and that Simon had been left without explanation or apology, which would explain the particular quality of his reserved manner, as if he had learned the hard way what happened when you left yourself uncovered. She did not know which version was true. She was aware that in this town, probably none of the versions were entirely true. She filed the information away the way she filed away everything that might later be relevant, and she concentrated on her property case and her sewing work, which Widow Hennessy had helped her establish through the local seamstress trade, and she tried not to think too much about Simon Boone. Then came October's last Saturday and the harvest fire. The annual Caldwell County Harvest Gathering had been a tradition since 1872, which made it a decade old and nearly ancient by the standards of a town that had itself only been incorporated in 1871. Every family in the county attended. Every family brought a dish to share. A communal bonfire was built in the wide flat space behind the feed mill, and the evening involved eating and music, and the specific social performance of a community celebrating itself in the way communities do when they have survived another year together. Lydia had not intended to attend. She understood perfectly well how the evening would go for her, and she had no appetite for the exercise in public humiliation. But Widow Hennessy, whose goodwill had become one of the anchors of her daily existence in Caldwell, had said quietly that she ought to go, that staying away would look like an admission of defeat, and that Lydia Monroe did not strike her as a woman who admitted defeat easily. So she went. She borrowed the widow's good cooking pot and made a hash of dried corn and smoked salt pork and late-seasoned squash, which she contributed to the communal table with the careful dignity of someone who is not going to let anyone see how much this costs her. And she took her tin plate and her cup, and she walked around that fire trying to find somewhere to sit, and nobody saved her a place. And the evening slowly revealed itself as the cruelty she had half expected and tried not to believe in. And then Simon Boone stood up and pointed. She sat down beside him, and for one moment, while the whole gathering recovered from its surprise and resumed its noise and its motion, she focused on the fire and breathed carefully through her nose and did not say anything at all. "The corn hash was yours," he said. "It was not a question either." Yes, it was the best thing on the table. He said it simply, as a statement of observed fact rather than a compliment intended to charm her. "Thank you." She paused. "Why did you do that?" He looked at the fire for a moment before answering. "Because Pete had just gotten up and the seat was empty," he said, "and I could see you'd been walking that circle for 20 minutes. It was not a grand declaration. It was just a plain answer. She appreciated the plainness of it more than she could have articulated. "People will talk," she said. "People in this town talk about the weather and whether Fred Alderman's bull got into the Mosher cornfield," he said. "One thing more or less makes no difference." She almost laughed. She did not, because the habit of laughter had been somewhat wrung out of her by several consecutive difficult years, but she felt the warmth of the almost laugh move through her chest, and it startled her with its unexpectedness. They sat together through the rest of the evening. Not close, not in any way that a careful observer could construe as improper. He introduced her to Pete Garrett when the foreman came back from the cider barrel, and Pete shook her hand with a weathered grip and said he'd heard she was a fine seamstress, and that he had a jacket that needed its lining replaced, and could she do that? She said she could. Simon spoke across the fire to a couple he identified quietly as the Tremins. Good people. Thomas Tremin farming 60 acres to the north, and Thomas Tremin, perhaps taking his cue from Simon Boone's conspicuous decision of the evening, tipped his hat to Lydia with genuine courtesy. By the time the fire had burned down to its comfortable late-evening stage and children were falling asleep against their mothers, Lydia was not exactly welcomed into Caldwell's social fabric. But she had been, for one evening, treated as if she had a right to be at the fire. And she knew, with the particular clarity she had developed for understanding power in social situations, that this had happened because Simon Boone had made a deliberate choice to use his considerable standing in this community for her benefit. She walked back to the dry goods store that night thinking, with the careful wariness of a woman who had been very wrong once before about a man's character, that she was going to have to be extremely careful about what she did with that knowledge. November arrived in Caldwell with cold wind and a flat gray sky that pressed down on the grasslands as if testing their tolerance for weight. Lydia's property case advanced. William Hatch received the survey results and confirmed that the boundary lines favored her claim, and Frank Alderman, calculating that his chances of winning had diminished considerably, agreed to an arrangement whereby Lydia retained the 12 acres including the spring, and the Aldermans received a right-of-way for their cattle to access that water during summer drought periods. It was not everything she had wanted, but it was substantially more than she had feared, and she signed the agreement in Hatch's office on a Wednesday morning in early November with the feeling of a person setting down a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten what it felt like to walk upright. She began making actual improvements to the property. The soddy was not salvageable as a dwelling, but the 12 acres had a stand of cottonwoods near the spring that could provide wood, and there was a structure at the back of the property that had been used as a small storage shed, but could, with work, be made into something more useful. She hired 2 men from town, brothers named Gus and Carl Wolfe, who were carpenters of middling skill and excellent reliability, to begin the basic work. She also began, quietly and without announcement, to expand her sewing work. Caldwell had no dressmaker of real skill. The women of means in the county either sent to Wichita for their better clothes or ordered from Chicago catalogs, which meant long waits and uncertain fit. Lydia had spent 3 years at a commercial textile operation in St. Louis and understood pattern work, and she had a natural sense for fit and construction that was better than she had ever tried to advertise. Within 2 weeks of the harvest fire, the number of women who had quietly approached her about sewing work had tripled. She was aware, and permitted herself only the smallest private satisfaction about the awareness, that this increase had everything to do with the fact that Simon Boone had sat beside her at the fire and let the whole county watch him do it. She saw him twice more in November. The first time was at the general store, where they found themselves both reading the same notice posted on the board near the front door, announcing a community meeting about the proposal to bring a new irrigation channel from the Kaskaskia River. They stood side by side for a moment reading the notice, and she said she thought irrigation would change the county's agricultural picture significantly, and he said he agreed, and they had a conversation about water rights and agricultural futures that lasted nearly 20 minutes and covered topics that nobody in this town had apparently thought she was worth discussing with. The second time was more consequential. She had been at the property, supervising the Wolfe brothers' work when a cold front moved in fast from the northwest with the vicious speed that Kansas weather specialized in, and by the time she realized she needed to be heading back to town, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the wind was carrying sleet. She was halfway to town, on foot because she had not yet bought a horse, when a buckboard came up behind her and Simon Boone said, "Get in the wagon, Miss Monroe, before you freeze standing up." She got in the wagon without argument, because she was practical, and because her coat was not adequate to the weather that had developed. He had been out at his eastern pasture checking fence lines, which the early winter weather sometimes damaged. The buckboard smelled of horses and hay and the particular clean cold of Kansas winter, and she sat on the seat beside him with her hands tucked inside her coat and the sleet tapping against the brim of his hat. "Your property is coming along," he said. He had driven past there apparently, though she was not sure when. "The Wolfe brothers are slower than I'd like, but the work is sound," she said. "Gus has trouble focusing, but Carl is excellent with structural elements," he said. "If you need the work to go faster, you could ask Carl to take the lead on anything load-bearing and give Gus the finishing work. He's actually very precise on finish work." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Carl and Gus put up the new horse barn at the Double B 2 years ago," he said. "I made the mistake of letting Gus take the lead on the main beam placement. Took 3 tries to get it level." She laughed. It came out easily, which surprised her. It had been several years since laughter came out of her easily. He glanced at her when she laughed. Something in his expression shifted briefly, like a door opening just far enough to let in a specific quality of light before closing again. She noticed it and stored it carefully in the back of her mind, where she kept the things she was not yet ready to examine fully. He left her at the dry goods store, and she went upstairs to her room and changed her damp clothes and made tea on the small stove, and sat at her sewing table thinking about nothing in particular for quite a long time. December came, and with it both the cold that the plains do properly and seriously, and a development that changed the social calculus of Caldwell in ways that were directly relevant to Lydia's situation. Clara Finch returned to the county. Clara Finch was 28, the daughter of Gerald Finch of the Northern Range, and she had spent the past 3 years in Topeka, where she had apparently been employed at a millinery establishment, and had become, according to the advance word that preceded her return, engaged to a Topeka banker named George Whitmore. She came back to the county to spend the Christmas season with her family before her spring wedding, and her arrival was greeted with the warm enthusiasm that a community saves for someone it has missed. Within 48 hours of Clara Finch's return, the Whisper network of Caldwell was operating at full capacity. The general consensus seemed to be that Clara was looking very well and that her upcoming marriage was evidence of her good sense, and that the manner in which her previous engagement had ended reflected more credit on her than on Simon Boone, and that Lydia Monroe had better not get ideas. Lydia, who had been careful to observe and calculate every social current in this town since her arrival, was not fooled by the fact that these whispers were apparently meant to reach her ears. They were a signal. Clara Finch or her allies were establishing territory, staking a claim on the narrative of Simon Boone's past, and the warning threaded through all of it was clear enough. This man belongs to a story that predates you, and you should know your place in it. The difficulty was that she was not entirely sure what her place was. She and Simon Boone were not courting. They were neighbors in the loosest sense, acquaintances who had spoken perhaps 6 times, who shared a mutual quality of observing the world carefully and saying what they actually meant, which was rarer than people understood. There was nothing between them that could properly be called anything, and yet. She thought about the way he had stood at the harvest fire. She thought about the buckboard in the sleet. She thought about the door opening briefly and his expression when she had laughed. She thought about these things in the determined, controlled way of someone who knows perfectly well that she is thinking about them more than she should, and she tried to redirect her attention to the property, the sewing work, the legal documentation for the deed that was still being finalized by William Hatch. It mostly worked. Clara Finch, for her part, managed to make her presence known to Lydia without speaking to her directly, which was a social skill that required considerable precision. She appeared at the dry goods store when Lydia was present and spoke to Widow Hennessy at length with the familiarity of old friendship, and when the widow introduced Lydia, Clara said, "Oh yes, I've heard about you," in a tone that packed an entire encyclopedia of implication into 6 words. She attended the Christmas social at the First Baptist Church, to which Lydia had not been invited, and was apparently the most celebrated guest of the evening. What Clara Finch could not control, and what clearly frustrated her if the reports filtering back through Caldwell's social telegraph were accurate, was what Simon Boone did. He came to see Lydia. Not in any way that was improper or that could be criticized by even the most determined critic. He arrived at the dry goods store on a cold December afternoon and asked if she would care to walk as far as the feed mill and back, because he had something he wanted to discuss with her about the property. She put on her coat and went. They walked along the wind-scoured wooden boardwalk of Main Street in the thin winter sunlight, and what he wanted to discuss about the property turned out to be a piece of information he had obtained from Thomas Tremaine, who was on the county land board, that the finalization of her deed registration was being held up by a procedural delay that could be resolved if she submitted a specific supplementary form to the county recorder's office before the end of the year. He had the form number. He had spoken to Thomas Tremaine specifically to find out whether anything could be done to expedite her situation. She stopped walking and looked at him. "You did that," she said. "You went and found that out for me." "Thomas owes me a horse evaluation," he said. "I called it in." "Why?" The question was direct because she was done with not asking direct questions about things she needed to understand. She had been careful and polite and indirect for months, and all it had gotten her was frozen out of every social gathering until a man she barely knew decided to stand up for her at a bonfire. She was done with indirection. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who is being required to say something they have decided to say, but have been arranging their words for carefully. "Because what's been done to you in this town is unjust," he said. "And I know what unjust treatment feels like, and I don't enjoy watching it happen to someone who doesn't deserve it." The wind moved between them, cold and carrying the smell of distant snow. "What did they do to you?" she asked. She knew it was a large question to ask a private man in the middle of a public street, but she asked it because she thought he was someone who respected the courage of direct questions even when they were uncomfortable. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at something down the street that was probably not what he was actually looking at. 3 years ago, he said finally, Clara Finch's father decided that the Double B, while an excellent operation, was not what he had in mind for his daughter's future. He had a banker from Topeka in mind. The problem was that Clara had agreed to marry me, and Gerald Finch could not simply dissolve an engagement without cause. So he created cause. She waited, not speaking. He let it be known, Simon said, that I had behaved improperly toward Clara before our engagement was formalized. That I had made advances that a decent man would not make. It was not true, but in a town like this, a story like that, once it's moving, cannot be stopped. Clara did not confirm it and did not deny it. Her silence was taken as confirmation. The engagement was broken, and Gerald Finch announced that his daughter had been treated badly and that the banker from Topeka was a far superior choice. And the town decided what I was. She understood, then, the complicated quality of the town's feeling towards Simon Boone. He had been tried in the court of community opinion and found guilty of something he had not done, and everyone knew it and no one had said so publicly, and the result was the particular kind of settled injustice that small communities are very good at living with indefinitely. They still believe it, she said. Some of them choose to, he said. It's more interesting than the truth. She thought about her own situation. The manner in which her marriage and its dissolution had been translated by gossip into something that defined her as less than respectable, when the actual story was simply that she had married a man who turned out to be dishonest and she had survived the consequences. The truth had never been as interesting to anyone as the simpler, worse version. "We are very similar in certain respects," she said. "I know," he said. "I noticed that some time ago." They looked at each other in the December wind with the particular directness of two people who have both learned, at some cost, to see things clearly. "I'll go to the county recorder's office tomorrow," she said. "Thank you for the information." "Merry Christmas, Miss Monroe," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Boone," she said, and they went their separate ways down the boardwalk. She filed the supplementary form the next day, and the deed was finalized before the new year. Christmas in Caldwell was quiet for Lydia. She spent Christmas Day with Widow Hennessy and the widow's sister, who came up from Arkansas for the holiday. She made a simple dinner and they exchanged small gifts, and the widow's sister told rambling stories about Arkansas winters that were neither interesting nor boring, simply the comfortable noise of people spending a cold day together. It was not grand, but it was warm in the literal sense, and Lydia found she did not need it to be grand. She thought about her father, which she had been avoiding since arriving in Caldwell. Gerald Monroe had left when she was 17, not the other way around. He had come west with a head full of land and cattle dreams, and had never come back for her the way he had vaguely promised he would when he had enough to offer her. She had stopped waiting after the first 2 years and built her own life, and the soddy with the collapsed roof and the 12 acres of Kansas flatland were the entirety of his legacy to her, and she was making something of it. She was glad she had come. She had not expected to be glad, but she was. On the 2nd day of January 1883, something happened that moved several things forward simultaneously. She had gone to the property to check on the storage shed conversion, which the Wolf brothers had made considerable progress on during December. The small building had been reinforced, the floor leveled, a new door fitted, and a small cast-iron stove installed. It was not a house, but it was a solid, weatherproof structure that could function as a workshop for her sewing work, which would mean she did not have to pay Widow Hennessy for the use of her front room any longer. She was examining the stove connections and thinking about what else would need to be done before the space was truly workable when she heard a horse approaching from the direction of the main road. It was Simon Boone on a bay gelding. She had not seen him ride before. He dismounted at the property fence, tied the horse to the post, and came through the gate. He had the look of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it before he can change his mind. "I have a proposition," he said without preamble, in the direct way she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. "I'm listening," she said. "I need a qualified person to manage the household accounts for the Double B," he said. "The ranch house accounts, the payroll scheduling, the supply ordering. Pete is excellent with cattle and men and completely useless with numbers. I've been doing it myself, but it's taking time I don't have in addition to the ranch management. The proposition is a fair wage for 2 half-days a week, and it could be done partly from here if you prefer to work from your own property." She looked at him steadily. "Are you offering me a position because you need the work done, or because you want to improve my financial situation?" "Both," he said, without hesitation. "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and I'm not going to pretend only one of them is true." She appreciated the honesty more than she could express. The combination of genuine usefulness and genuine goodwill was not common. She had learned to be suspicious of help that came attached to obligation, but she had also learned, at some cost, that refusing all help on principle was simply pride performing as practicality. "My bookkeeping is good," she said. "I managed the supply accounts at the textile house in St. Louis for 18 months. "I know," he said. "Widow Hennessy told me." She almost laughed again. "You asked her?" "I asked her," he confirmed, with the very faint quality of amusement that passed for his version of warmth. She agreed to the proposition, and this was the beginning of the period that she would later think of as the time when she began to know Simon Boone the way a person actually knows another person, rather than the way you know a face in a town or a reputation passed through a telegraph wire. She went to the Double B ranch house for the first time on a Thursday in the second week of January, and was let in by Pete Garrett, who showed her to the office at the back of the house, with the manner of a man who is very relieved to hand something over to someone competent. The office was a good-sized room with a solid desk, adequate light from a south-facing window, and an absolute chaos of paper that informed her immediately that the accounts had not been properly organized in at least 6 months. She spent the first 3 hours simply sorting, and when Simon came in from the pastures at midday with cold in his coat and snow on his boots, she had 4 separate stacks of documents in 4 separate categories and a list of questions. They sat across the desk from each other, and she asked her questions, and he answered them. And this pattern, which repeated every Thursday and every alternate Monday, became over the following weeks the most substantial conversation she had ever had with anyone. Not because the topics were always large, though sometimes they were, but because both of them brought to the conversation the quality of actual attention and actual honesty and the willingness to say things plainly, and these qualities together created something between them that was quietly, persistently remarkable. She learned things about him. She learned that he had been running the Double B since he was 20, and that the first 3 years had been very hard, drought and poor prices, and once a disease moving through the herd that killed 40 head in a month. She learned that he had come through all of it by making decisions carefully and honoring his commitments to his men, and that the thing he was proudest of was that Pete Garrett had stayed with him through the worst years when there were other ranches offering better terms. She learned that he read when he could, that there was a shelf in the ranch house parlor with a genuine collection of books that were not ornamental, that he had opinions about things he had read. She learned that he was quietly, fiercely intelligent in a way that the Cattleman exterior was not designed to advertise. He learned things about her. She told him, with less than her usual defenses, the actual story of Charles Aldous. Not the version the town had heard, but the true account, with its full complexity. The young woman she had been when she married him, naive in the particular way that competence in some areas can leave you blind in others, and the slow, terrible education of discovering that the man you trusted was fundamentally dishonest, and the years of consequence. She told him about St. Louis and the textile house and the small room with the drafty window, and the letter from William Hatch, and the feeling of arriving in Caldwell on the stage to claim a legacy that turned out to be a collapsed roof. "And yet you didn't leave," he said. "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about it. "Because I had already run away from one situation," she said. "I ran to St. Louis from this county after my father left. I stayed there and built a small life and didn't run again even when it was hard. This felt like the same choice. I could go somewhere else and start over again with nothing, or I could stay and fight for what I'd come here to claim." He was quiet for a moment. "You're a brave woman, Lydia Monroe." It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed. The room felt different by a small degree that was somehow enormous. "I'm a stubborn one," she said. "Bravery implies you've weighed the risk properly. I think I was just too tired to calculate it." He smiled. A real one, not the barely there inflection of amusement she had seen before, but an actual smile that changed the whole geometry of his face. She felt it register in her chest like a struck match. She rode back to town on the horse she had purchased in December, a steady roan mare she had named Ada, and the cold air was clean, and the plains were flat and white under the January sky, and she allowed herself, for the first time in the whole careful winter, to acknowledge that she was falling in love with Simon Boone. Then she put that knowledge away in the most disciplined compartment of her mind, and did not take it out again for 3 weeks, because she had been catastrophically wrong about a man before, and the damage had cost her 4 years of her life and most of her trust, and she was not going to let herself simply tumble forward into feeling without being absolutely certain of what she was falling toward. She was, as she had told him, stubborn rather than brave. The complications arrived in February, because complications are seasonal in the way that Kansas weather is, arriving without apology and demanding response. Clara Finch had extended her visit beyond Christmas. The Topeka banker, George Whitmore, had come to Caldwell in January and been entertained by the Finch family for a week, and the engagement appeared to be solid, but Clara had not returned to Topeka. Instead, she seemed to have settled back into Caldwell life with the ease of someone who had never fully intended to leave, and in February she made her position regarding Simon Boone perfectly clear. She came to see him at the Double B. Lydia knew this only because Pete Garrett mentioned it, casually and without apparent awareness of its weight, on a Thursday when she arrived at the ranch house, and Clara had left perhaps an hour before. "Miss Finch was here earlier," Pete said, in the way of someone filing routine information. "Her and Mr. Boone had a long talk in the parlor." Lydia organized the supply invoices and did not ask any questions about the conversation, because it was not her place, and because she was not ready for it to be her place, and because she was still very carefully not examining her own feelings. Simon was not at the ranch house that Thursday. He was out at the south pasture dealing with a fence situation. He came back at mid-afternoon when she was already packing up to leave, and something in the set of his expression told her the day had been difficult. "I'll see you Monday," she said, professional and tidy. "Lydia," he said her name with a directness that stopped her in the doorway. "Clara is telling people that she and I have been in correspondence since September, that we've been reconciling privately while she was in Topeka." She turned around. "And have you?" "No," he said. "We have not exchanged a single letter. I haven't spoken to Clara Finch in over 2 years before today." She looked at him carefully. She trusted her own perception of this man, and her perception was that he was incapable of deliberate dishonesty. Why would she say it? "Because George Whitmore," he said, with the flat inflection of someone delivering bad news they have already processed enough to say calmly, "appears to have reconsidered the engagement. Clara received a letter last week. She came to see me today to propose that we repair what her father destroyed 3 years ago." "I see," Lydia said. "I told her no," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the February wind moved across the plains in long, slow sweeps that she could hear even through the walls. "Because of the history," she said. "Because of other reasons," he said, and his dark eyes were direct and steady, and saying something larger than the words he was using. in the way of a man who has decided to be honest, but is choosing the size of the step carefully. She stood in the doorway with her coat buttoned and her accounting book under her arm, and her heart doing the complicated thing again that it had been doing in increasing frequency in Simon Boone's vicinity, and she made a decision. The decision felt like the same quality of choice she had made when she got out of the stagecoach in Caldwell, when she stayed in the soddy 2 nights rather than retreating, when she submitted the survey results and fought the Alderman brothers rather than surrendering the claim. It felt like the choice to stay and be present in her own life rather than managing it from a safe distance. "What other reasons?" she said. He came across the office to her, which was only about 12 feet and took perhaps 4 seconds, but felt in the way that small distances can feel in charged moments, as if it were something much more significant traversed. He stopped close enough that she could see the particular quality of his expression, open and certain, and without the careful reserve she had watched him maintain for months. "You know why," he said quietly. "I would like to hear it said," she said. He almost smiled. "Because there is a woman in this county who came here with a carpetbag and a bad piece of property, and a story that everyone in town decided made her worthless. And in 5 months she has won her legal case, built her sewing business, converted a falling-down shed into a workshop, and organized my accounts so completely that Pete actually understands the payroll schedule for the first time in 3 years," he said. "And that woman has sat across my desk every Thursday and Monday and said exactly what she thinks and asked exactly what she means to ask, and I have not wanted to spend this much time in a room with any person in my entire adult life." She breathed once, steadily. "And," he said more quietly, "I have been watching you navigate a town that has treated you unjustly since the day you arrived, and I think you are the strongest person I have met in Caldwell, Kansas, which is not a place that produces soft people." "I am not always strong," she said honestly. "There were several evenings in November when I sat in my room above the dry goods store and cried for an unreasonable amount of time." "That's part of what I mean," he said. "You can say that and stand here anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring everything she knew about him against everything she had learned about her own judgment in the years since she had trusted it badly. The measurement came back, as it had been coming back quietly for months, with a result that was clear and consistent, and nothing like the dazzled urgency that had characterized her feelings about Charles Aldous when she was 19. This was something sturdier and more specific. This was the feeling of recognizing something true. "I have feelings for you," she said. "I have been trying to determine whether they are trustworthy." "Have you made a determination?" he said, with a careful steadiness that she recognized as him holding himself very still so as not to apply pressure. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the one not holding the accounting book, and held it with the grip of someone who has thought carefully about what he is committing to and is at peace with it. His hand was warm and considerably larger than hers, and carried the specific texture of a man who worked with them, and she felt the warmth travel from her palm up her arm and into her chest, and settle there with the particular quality of something that intends to stay. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." "I am willing," she said. He walked her out to where Ada was tied, and she rode back to town in the February cold with her face warm and her mind very clear, which was unusual in her experience of strong feeling. Usually feeling mudded things. But this felt different. This felt like clarity rather than confusion, like arriving somewhere rather than departing. The courtship of Simon Boone and Lydia Monroe was conducted with the practical, earnest quality of 2 people who did not have time for decoration, but understood the value of what they were building. He came to call at the dry goods store on Sunday afternoons, which was the day Lydia did not have her sewing appointments or her accounting work. He brought her things that were useful as well as things that were simply gifts. Once a very good saddle blanket for Ada, because he had noticed the mare's old one was wearing thin, and once a small oil lamp of better quality than the one she had in her workshop, because he had seen her working in inadequate light. She gave him things back, a methodically organized set of supply contact ledgers for the double B that she had constructed from his chaotic records over months, and a cake made from a recipe she had learned from her mother before everything went sideways, which Pete Garrett declared the best thing he had eaten in the county, possibly ever. They went for rides on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted. They talked on those rides the way they had been talking across the office desk, about everything and nothing, with the comfort of two people who have already discovered that they can be honest with each other and have decided to go on being so. Clara Finch made one more attempt in the social sphere, circulating a revised version of her history with Simon that positioned herself as the injured party in a new and more elaborate way, and Lydia heard it through the usual channels and said nothing publicly, and said to Simon privately exactly what she thought of it, which made him laugh with genuine warmth. And that was the last time Clara Finch was a subject of serious consideration in their lives. In March, Gerald Finch, whose maneuvering 3 years ago had destroyed his daughter's engagement to a good man in favor of a Topeka banker who had since thought better of the arrangement, came to the Double B hat in hand to see Simon Boone. Lydia was not present for this conversation. She heard about it from Pete, who had been present, and who seemed to feel that sharing a full account with Lydia was part of his professional responsibilities. Gerald Finch had come to apologize. He had come late and he had come awkwardly, and the apology was more in the nature of an explanation than a true reckoning with what he had done, but he had come. Simon had listened and said that he appreciated the acknowledgement and that he held no ongoing malice toward the Finch family, and that he wished Clara well in her future. Then he had thanked Gerald Finch for coming and shown him out. Pete said that afterward Simon had stood at the parlor window looking at the south pasture for a while, and then he had gone back to work. How did he seem? Lydia asked Pete. Like a man who put something down that he didn't realize he was still carrying, Pete said. She thought about that for several days. In April, Simon asked her to marry him. He did it without grandeur, which was appropriate to both of them. They had ridden out to the eastern part of his property, where the Chicaskia River ran shallow and clear over limestone, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves in the warm April air. They were sitting on a flat rock above the water, and the day was the kind of day that Kansas produces in spring as if to apologize for everything it does the rest of the year, brilliant and warm and smelling of grass and water. He said her name, and she looked at him, and he said, "I want to spend my life with you. I want you to be my wife. I know this is fast in some ways and slow in others, and I know your experience with marriage has given you good reasons to be cautious. If you need more time, I will wait, but I want you to know what I'm hoping for." She thought about it for exactly long enough to honor the seriousness of the question. "It is fast in calendar terms," she said. "But I have been married before, and I know the difference between choosing someone because your judgment is good and choosing someone because you were young and dazzled. My judgment is good and I am not dazzled. I know who you are." "Is that a yes?" he said, with a careful, hopeful quality in his voice that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, and that she found, consequently, entirely devastating in the best possible sense. "That is an absolute yes," she said. He kissed her then for the first time, beside the river in the April sunlight, with the cottonwood leaves moving overhead and the water making its low limestone sound beneath them. And it was the kind of kiss that is very quiet and very certain and asks nothing because everything has already been understood. They were married in June 1883 in the Caldwell First Baptist Church, which made room for them with somewhat more warmth than it had previously managed, because Simon Boone was a man of standing in the county, and the county had largely decided by June that its previous treatment of Lydia Monroe had perhaps been excessive. This change of heart was the kind of thing that would have once made Lydia bitter, but she found she had very little energy for bitterness when she was busy being happy. Widow Hennessy sat in the front row and wept with open satisfaction. Pete Garrett was Simon's best man and looked terrified throughout the ceremony in the way of large men in formal situations. Thomas Tremaine and his wife were there, and Carl and Gus Wolfe, and several of the ranching families who had come around to the view that Lydia Monroe was a respectable woman and a smart one, and that the county ought to be glad to have her. She wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool chally with a fitted bodice and a train that was modest and exactly right, and she carried a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Simon had found somewhere. She never quite established where, because she had not thought to ask him to, and he had simply provided them, which was characteristic of him in ways she had come to love specifically. She walked down the aisle of that church and felt, for the first time in very many years, that she was walking toward something rather than away from something. They were married, and she became Lydia Boone, and she kept the Monroe as well because it was hers, and she had earned it, and there was no law against a woman knowing where she had come from. The first year of their marriage had the particular quality of two people who know each other well beginning to know each other in the new and much more detailed way that living together creates. They had conversations that went on for 2 hours and conversations that were 3 words. They disagreed about things, meaningfully and without drama, and worked out the disagreements the way they worked out everything, by saying what they actually meant until they found where they actually agreed. She found that marriage to a man who was constitutionally incapable of dishonesty was a completely different experience than her previous understanding of the institution. She moved into the Double B Ranch house, which was a substantial wooden structure that Simon had built properly in 1879 to replace the original soddy, with 5 rooms and a wide porch facing south and east. She brought Ada and her sewing equipment and her accounting books and the tin box with her father's papers, and she arranged these things in the ranch house with the deliberate care of a woman who has not had a real home in a long time and intends to have one now. Her 12 acres remained in her name. She kept paying the Wolfe brothers to maintain the spring and the workshop structure, and she went there regularly. It was important to her, the piece of land, in a way she didn't always try to articulate because it existed below the level of words. It was the thing she had come to this county for, before she found everything else she had not expected to find here. She was keeping it. The Double B accounts ran smoothly under her management, and Simon expanded his cattle operation in the fall of 1883, acquiring an adjacent parcel from a rancher named Morrison who was retiring south to New Mexico. This expansion required a significantly larger crew, and the hiring process, which Simon and Pete undertook together, produced a roster of men that Lydia organized the payroll for with her characteristic thoroughness. One of the new hires was a man named James Early, who came recommended from a ranch outside Dodge City and proved himself competent within the first week. He was also, it became apparent, a man with a dark past that had followed him north from Dodge City in the form of a wanted circular that arrived in Caldwell's sheriff's office in November 1883, relating to an altercation in Ford County in 1881 that had left a man injured. The sheriff, a steady man named Walt Decker, came to the Double B, and the situation was sorted out with more drama than it deserved, because James Early turned out to have been defending himself against someone who had tried to rob him, and the original report had been made by a biased party, and Walt Decker, who knew the difference between a man with a violent nature and a man with a bad history he'd already settled, determined that Early posed no threat to Caldwell County and allowed him to remain. Lydia handled this episode by remaining completely calm and reviewing Early's work record, which was exemplary, and telling Simon what she thought. Simon trusted her judgment, as he consistently did, and James Early stayed on at the Double B and proved his worth many times over in subsequent years. In December 1883, Lydia discovered she was with child. She told Simon on a Sunday evening when they were sitting in the ranch house parlor after supper the cast-iron stove radiating warmth into the room and snow building silently outside the windows. She said it directly because she did things directly. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the summer." He set down the book he had been reading and looked at her with the quality of attention that she had first noticed about him on a street in Caldwell 14 months ago and had been grateful for every day since. Then he crossed the room and sat down next to her on the settee and took her hand and said, very quietly, "Are you well?" Not congratulations. Not commentary about legacy or the ranch or what having a son would mean for the double B, just, "Are you well?" She was. She was extremely well. The first months were difficult in the physical way of such things, but she was healthy and strong, and she managed her sewing work and the accounts without significant interruption, which she was proud of in a way she chose not to hide because she felt like it was important to demonstrate that expecting a child was not an illness, but a condition a competent woman could navigate. Simon was careful with her without being precious about it, which was exactly the right balance. He did not wrap her in cotton or speak to her in the simplified tones that some men adopted with pregnant women, as if the state affected the brain. He talked to her exactly as he always had, and he also quietly made sure that the woodbox was always full and the water was always in, and that Ada was saddled and waiting whenever she needed to go to her workshop. And he did all of these things without making a production of any of them. Their son was born in July 1884, on a brilliant and extremely hot Kansas summer day that made the experience considerably more arduous than it might otherwise have been. The midwife, Mrs. Caroline Webb, who had attended more Caldwell County births than anyone could count, declared him a fine, strong boy of good size and excellent voice, demonstrating the last attribute loudly and repeatedly. He had Simon's dark hair and Lydia's gray eyes, and they named him Gerald after her father, which felt like the right way to honor a complicated legacy. Gerald Monroe Boone was a healthy, demanding, thoroughly beloved child who from his very first weeks demonstrated a quality that both his parents recognized and appreciated. He paid attention. He watched things. He followed movement with those serious gray eyes with the concentration of someone who was going to form an opinion shortly and would like more information first. "He's like both of you," Pete Garrett announced, observing the baby on a visit to the ranch house. "Lord help us." Lydia laughed and Simon smiled and little Gerald regarded Pete with his full analytical attention, and Pete seemed to find this somewhat unnerving in an infant, which everyone agreed was entirely reasonable. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, with enough change and enough challenge to keep life honest, and enough joy to balance the accounting. In 1885, the cattle business shifted significantly as the trail drives continued to decline, and the Kansas beef market changed with the expansion of the railroad and the enclosure of range land. Simon saw the changes coming early, which was characteristic, and began adjusting the Double B's operation accordingly, increasing the quality and selectivity of the herd rather than the raw numbers, and establishing a direct relationship with a beef buyer in Kansas City that bypassed the traditional middlemen. These decisions were not popular with every ranching family in the county, some of whom felt that adapting to change was a kind of betrayal of tradition, but they proved, over the following years, to be exactly correct. Lydia's sewing business grew past the point of a one-woman operation. She took on an assistant, a young woman named Harriet Cole, who had come to Caldwell with her family from Ohio and had excellent hands and a good eye for color. Lydia taught her pattern work in construction and the particular mathematics of fitting that distinguished a well-made garment from a merely adequate one. By 1886, Monroe Dressmaking, which operated out of the workshop on Lydia's 12 acres and maintained a small front room at a location on Main Street, was the most sought-after dressmaking establishment in Caldwell County and received orders from as far away as Wichita. The name Monroe, on the sign and in the accounts, was deliberate. She had not become Boone at the expense of Monroe. She had become both, and she intended to keep both visible. Simon came to the Monroe dressmaking shop on a Saturday in the spring of 1886 while she was in a fitting with a customer, and Harriet showed him to the back room to wait. And when Lydia finished and came to find him, he was sitting in a chair that was considerably smaller than appropriate for his frame, reading a pattern catalog with the expression of someone who has found the subject more interesting than expected. "There is more geometry in this than I anticipated," he said, looking up. "Pattern drafting is pure geometry," she said. "I have been telling you this for 3 years." "You have," he admitted. "I should have listened sooner." "You should have listened sooner to a great many things," she said, with the affectionate tartness that had become the characteristic register of their private communication. "Most of them," he agreed, and then he smiled at her in the way that still, 3 years into their marriage, made her feel the struck-match sensation in her chest. He had come to tell her that Pete Garrett intended to retire at the end of the summer. Pete was 63, and his knees were causing him serious trouble, and he had a sister in Arkansas whose husband had died and who had asked him to come and help with her small farm, and Pete had decided that was the right next chapter. Simon had been thinking about who to elevate to foreman, and he wanted her opinion because he trusted her read on the men who worked the double B. They talked through the candidates. She had opinions, detailed and specific, based on 2 years of managing their payroll and supply accounts, and observing in that data the patterns that revealed character. Who ordered what they actually needed without inflation, who documented their time accurately, who tracked the equipment maintenance costs with the care of someone who understood that the ranch's resources were not infinite. James Early, she said. James Early had been steady and honest and increasingly skilled for 3 years, and he had demonstrated judgment under pressure during the Morrison parcel incident in a way that Lydia had noted and filed. He was not a man with an easy past, but he had made something honest of it, and a man who did that could be trusted with responsibility. Simon made James Early the foreman of the Double B in September 1886, when Pete Garrett retired south to Arkansas to help his sister, and they gave Pete a proper send-off at a gathering at the ranch house that was, in its warmth and its fullness, and its complete lack of social cruelty, everything the harvest fire of 1882 had not been. Pete embraced Lydia when he left and said, rough-voiced, that finding her had been the best thing Simon had done since he built the horse barn. Lydia told Pete that he had been the first person in Caldwell County to treat her as a neighbor without calculation, and that she would not forget it. Pete rode south with his eyes somewhat bright. The harvest fire came around every year, and every year Lydia attended, and every year she sat beside Simon in a place that was very clearly saved for her, surrounded by people who had come, over the years and with varying degrees of grace, to understand that Lydia Monroe Boone was a permanent and irreplaceable feature of Caldwell County life. In 1887, their daughter was born, and they named her Mee after Simon's mother, who had died when he was 15. Mee was a loud, cheerful, entirely confident child who seemed to have inherited no one's particular quality of reserve, and found the world a comprehensively entertaining place from her very first conscious moments. She and Gerald, who was 3 when she arrived, regarded each other initially with mutual suspicion that resolved within a month into the particular alliance of siblings who have decided to combine their different capacities for maximum effectiveness. Gerald watched and analyzed. Mee acted boldly and frequently. Together they were formidable. The ranch house, which had been generously sized for Simon alone and very comfortable for 2, was busy and warm and somewhat chaotic with a 4-year-old and an infant, and Lydia arranged this chaos with the competence she brought to everything, and Simon existed within it with the steadiness he brought to everything, and they were happy in the way that requires no particular announcement because it is simply the texture of daily life. The legal situation that had shadowed Lydia's first months in Caldwell was fully resolved. Her property deed was registered, clean and uncontested, and her 12 acres sat there productively with the spring running clear, and the cottonwoods growing taller every year, and the workshop where she had built her business a solid and permanent structure. The Alderman brothers, who had tried to challenge her claim, had diversified into wheat farming and were cordial enough in the street that you would not know, looking at them, that they had once tried to take what was hers. Frank Alderman told someone once, in a moment of self-assessment that apparently surprised even him, that Lydia Monroe had been the smarter opponent, and he had known it from the moment she produced that 1875 bill of sale. Lydia heard about this remark secondhand and said nothing, though she permitted herself a private satisfaction that was small and clean and entirely deserved. In the spring of 1888, when Gerald was nearly 4 and me was 9 months, and the Double B was running more profitably than it ever had, something happened that brought everything in Lydia's life briefly into sharp and painful focus. A letter arrived from St. Louis. It was from a lawyer she did not know, representing the estate of Charles Aldous, who had died in Nevada in February of a fever. Charles Aldous had died with virtually no assets, several substantial debts, and apparently a complicated personal situation that the Nevada lawyer was in the process of unraveling. The St. Louis lawyer was writing to inform Lydia that Charles Aldous had listed, in documents he had filed in 1880, that Lydia Monroe Aldous was in some manner connected to a small piece of property in Missouri that he had claimed as collateral for a loan, and the question of the validity of this claim was part of the estate's legal complexity. She had no idea what Missouri property Charles Aldous could have used her name in connection with, because she had never had property in Missouri, and Charles Aldous had had no right to use her name for anything after the dissolution of their marriage. She wrote back to the St. Louis lawyer with a document she composed herself, clear and specific, and citing the date of the legal dissolution and the terms, and enclosing a certified copy of the dissolution decree which she had kept very carefully in the tin box for exactly this kind of contingency. She told Simon about it the same evening the letter arrived. She had learned the cost of keeping complications to herself, and she had also learned that Simon Boone was the most reliably useful person she knew for thinking through problems, not because he always had the answer, but because he listened well enough that thinking out loud in his presence often produced the answer herself. "He's been dead for 6 weeks and he's still making things complicated," she said, with more weariness than bitterness. "Does the Missouri property claim have any actual validity?" Simon asked. "None whatsoever," she said. "I was not party to any Missouri property arrangement, and our marriage was dissolved before 1880 in any case. Whatever Charles put my name on, he did it without my knowledge or consent, and I have the dissolution decree to demonstrate that he had no right to." "Then you've already solved it," he said, looking at the letter and her response side by side on the parlor table. "I believe so," she said. "I wanted you to know." He looked at her across the table with the same quality of attention she had first noticed about him in 1882, unchanged by 5 years of daily proximity, and said, "I want to know everything. You know that." She did know that. It was one of the things she loved most specifically about him, the St. Louis lawyer received her response, confirmed that her position was legally sound, and removed her from the estate proceedings. Charles Aldous departed from her life for the last time, cleanly and completely, and she did not think about him again with any frequency. Caldwell changed around them in the late 1880s. The great cattle drive era truly wound down, as the railroad continued south and the Texas ranchers found new routes, and the town that had built itself on the roar of longhorn herds and trail drive wages became something quieter and more settled, a county seat with agricultural ambitions and a smaller, more stable economy. Some businesses closed. Some families moved on. New families arrived, farmers rather than cattlemen mostly, wheat and sorghum growers who were changing the landscape of the county from open range to fenced cultivation. Simon navigated this transition with the same forward-looking intelligence he had brought to every challenge since his father's death had left him in charge of the Double B at 20. He reduced the herd to a highly curated quality operation, developed a reputation for premium beef that commanded prices from Kansas City buyers that compensated for the smaller volume, and gradually diversified into some wheat cultivation on the southern portion of the property. James Early, as foreman, proved Lydia's judgment absolutely correct. He was steady and loyal and growing more skilled every year. Lydia's business adapted too. As Caldwell became more agricultural and less raw frontier, the women of the county had both more stability and more aspiration, and the demand for quality dressmaking grew rather than diminished. She took on a second assistant in 1889, a woman named Dorothy Marsh, who had been making clothes in her home for years and had considerable skill that simply needed proper organization and training. Monroe Dressmaking by 1889 had a real shop on Main Street, 3 workers including Lydia herself, and a reputation that extended to Wichita and beyond. She sat on the County Business Association when it was formed in 1889, as one of 3 women among 12 members, and she said what she thought at the meetings, which was not always what the other members expected but which was consistently relevant and correct. The other members learned over the first year to listen when Lydia Monroe Boone spoke, because she did not speak unless she had something specific to contribute, and when she did speak, it was worth the attention. In the early autumn of 1889, Simon came home from a trip to Kansas City where he had met with the beef buyer and formalized a multi-year contract, and he was in a better mood than usual, which was saying something because his usual mood was already good, and he brought Lydia a book from a Kansas City shop that she had mentioned once, months ago, that she wanted to read. He had remembered. He had gone into a bookshop in Kansas City and asked for it by name. She stood in the ranch house doorway with the book in her hands and looked at him and felt the clean warmth of loving someone who pays attention, who remembers, who shows up with the small specific things that prove they have been listening all along. "Thank you," she said. "Come in from the cold." He came in and Gerald, who was 5 and worshipped his father with the intensity of a small boy who has not yet learned to be casual about his feelings, launched himself across the room at Simon, who caught him without dropping his saddlebag, and me toddled determinedly toward the commotion from the kitchen doorway. And the ranch house was full of noise and warmth, and the ordinary miracle of a family in motion. They held their own harvest gathering in October 1889, at the Double B, inviting the neighbors and the families they had come to know genuinely over 7 years. Thomas and Mary Tremaine came, and the Wolfe brothers and their families, and James Early and his wife Ellen, whom he had married the previous spring, and Widow Hennessy, who was slower than she had been but still sharp, and a dozen other families who had been part of the fabric of their county life. They built the fire in the wide space south of the house, and Simon carried out the split-log benches himself, and Lydia organized the food tables with Harriet Cole's help. And when the fire was lit and the evening was underway, and every person there had a place and a plate, and the smoke went up into the October stars, Lydia stood for a moment at the edge of the firelight and looked at all of it. She was 33 years old. She had come to this county with a carpetbag and a secret and a collapsed soddy and no allies, and she had built, from those materials and from her own particular combination of stubbornness and intelligence, and the willingness to recognize and accept extraordinary goodness when it presented itself, a life of such fullness that she could barely encompass it when she tried to look at it directly. Simon appeared at her side, carrying 2 cups of cider, and handed her one without comment. "7 years ago," she said. "Approximately," he said. "You stood up at a fire and pointed," she said. Pete had vacated the space, he said, in the exact same flat, factual tone he had used that October evening in 1882. "You know perfectly well that is not why you did it," she said. He looked at the fire for a moment and then at her with all of his attention and none of his reserve. "No," he agreed quietly. "It is not why I did it." "Why did you?" she said. She had never quite asked him directly. In all the conversations they had had about all the things they had discussed over 7 years of marriage and the months before it, he was quiet for the length of a breath. "Because you had been walking that circle for 20 minutes, he said, "and every person there was pretending not to see you, and I thought you were the most composed person I had ever watched try to maintain dignity under pressure, and I thought it was time someone acknowledged that you existed." She looked at him with the gray eyes that had seen Kansas before the storm and after it and all the weather in between, and she said, "You saved considerably more than a place at a fire." "You would have saved yourself," he said. "You were doing it already." "Yes," she said, "but not like this." He put his arm around her. There in the firelight with the October night cool around them, and their children running between the benches with the other children and the music starting up near the far side of the fire, and she leaned into him with the specific ease of a person leaning against something that has never yet failed to hold. The decade turned. 1890 arrived, and the world was changing faster than it ever had before. The frontier was not quite the frontier anymore. The last of the great open range in Kansas was being fenced. The cattle drives were history. The men who had made their names on the trail and the open grassland were becoming figures in a story that was already passing into legend, while the people who had lived it were still alive to tell it. But in Caldwell County, on the 8,000 acres of the Double B Ranch, and in the workshop on Lydia Monroe's 12 acres by the spring, things had the solidity of something built to last. Simon turned 40 in 1891 and was still, in Lydia's entirely biased and also accurate assessment, the finest man she had ever known. He had gray coming in at his temples that made him look authoritative in a way that his natural seriousness had always implied, but the calendar was now formalizing. He was still in the habit of listening before speaking and meaning what he said, and not saying anything he did not mean, which were habits she valued more rather than less as she encountered people who did not have them. Gerald was 7 in 1891, and showing every sign of being someone who would pay attention to the world and respond to it thoughtfully, which his parents regarded with equal measures of pride, and the private knowledge that thoughtful, attentive people had a harder time of some things than people who moved through the world without much reflection. Me was 4 and fearless and entirely comfortable in her own opinions, which she expressed frequently and with authority. The future was going to hear from me considerably. In the spring of 1892, Lydia discovered she was expecting a third child, and this time the announcement at the parlor table produced a response from Gerald, who had reached the age of understanding such information, of solemn and proprietary interest, and from me, a declaration that she wanted a brother because she had been the youngest and thought being the youngest was boring. Me got her brother. He was born in November 1892, a healthy boy they named Thomas after Thomas Tremaine, who had been the first man in Caldwell County outside of Simon himself to treat Lydia Monroe with genuine respect, and who had died the previous spring at 68, quietly in his sleep, in the way of a man who had done his work and was at peace with it. Thomas Boone was a cheerful, sturdy child who confounded both his parents with the placid ease of his temperament. Gerald had been thoughtful and me had been bold, and Thomas was simply content, interested in everything and disturbed by almost nothing, with a gift for finding the comfortable middle ground of any situation that everyone around him found both restful and somewhat astonishing. Me announced within a week of Thomas's arrival that he was acceptable and that she would look after him. She kept this commitment throughout his childhood with a ferocity that was characteristically hers, and that Thomas accepted with characteristic calm. The Monroe dressmaking shop on Main Street employed 4 women by 1893, and Lydia had begun teaching a pattern drafting class on Wednesday afternoons for women who wanted to learn the skill for their own use. This was not a profitable enterprise in financial terms, but it was important to her in the way that the 12 acres were important to her, as something that existed because she had decided it should exist, and that served a purpose beyond the immediate accounting. Several of the women who came to those Wednesday classes were women who had, in the years before they came to know Lydia Boone, been among the people who had not saved her a place at the harvest fire. She did not mention this. She taught them how to measure and draft and cut, and she found that the teaching itself, the watching of someone new understand how a flat piece of fabric could be transformed by precise geometry into something three-dimensional and wearable, was genuinely satisfying in a way that went beyond any satisfaction she could derive from holding old grudges. She had said to Simon once, in one of the long Sunday conversations that remained the constant of their life together through all its changes, that she thought the trick to not being consumed by bitterness was to stay genuinely busy with things that mattered. He had said he thought that was mostly right, but that he also thought you had to eventually decide to let things go, not because the injuries were not real, but because carrying them indefinitely was simply too expensive. She had said that was easy advice for someone who had always been able to let things go. He had said she was right. It probably was easier for him than for her, and that he admired the work she did to get there. She had appreciated the honesty of the acknowledgement so much more than a simple reassurance would have served. That was their marriage. Honest and warm, and built on the particular foundation that two people establish when they have both been treated unjustly by the world and have separately developed the habit of seeing things clearly and then, by some enormous good fortune, found each other. By 1895, Caldwell County was well and truly in its settled agricultural chapter, and the Double B under Simon and James Early's management was a stable and respected operation, one of the landmarks of the region. The annual gathering they hosted in October had become one of the events of the county calendar, attended by 3 times the people who had come to that first one in 1889, and known for good food and good music, and the particular quality of welcome that a house with Lydia Boone in it tended to generate. She stood at the fire every year and allowed herself to feel the distance between then and now, not with bitterness, but with the particular appreciation that comes from knowing what something cost. In the summer of 1896, William Hatch, the lawyer who had written the letter that brought her to Caldwell in the first place, and who had subsequently helped her fight for the 12 acres and later notarized various documents of her business and her marriage, retired from his practice and sold to a younger lawyer from Wichita. He came to say goodbye at the ranch house, and Lydia served him coffee and one of her mother's cakes and listened to his stories about 40 years of Caldwell County law, and when he left she shook his hand and thanked him for the letter. "I've never been thanked for writing a letter announcing someone's inheritance," he said, looking somewhat puzzled. "It brought me here," she said simply. He seemed to understand that this was the whole of the explanation, and he left satisfied. Gerald turned 12 in 1896 and was already clearly going to be someone who worked with his mind as much as his hands. Simon had him learning the ranch operation from the ground up, as Simon himself had learned it, but they both knew the boy's particular kind of intelligence was going to take him toward something specific. And when Gerald announced at supper one evening that he wanted to be an engineer and build things like bridges and irrigation systems, the table received this with the combination of pride and practical forward-thinking that characterized the Boone family's response to most important information. Me at 9 announced that she intended to run a business. Nobody at the table was surprised. Thomas at 4 announced that he wanted more biscuits. This was also received with full seriousness, and the biscuits were forthcoming. The century moved toward its end. The West was changing, settling into itself, becoming something domesticated and complex rather than raw and provisional. The frontier was gone, officially declared so by the historians in 1890, and what remained was simply the land and the people who had stayed to build something on it. Lydia Monroe Boone was one of those people. She had stayed when she could have retreated. She had built when building was hard and costly. She had allowed herself to be known by someone honest and had known him in return. And from that knowing had grown a life of such genuine richness that, when she counted what she had, it seemed like something that belonged to a story, except that she had lived every day of it. And she knew that stories were almost never this specific and particular in their happiness. On an October evening in 1897, she sat beside Simon Boone at their harvest fire, surrounded by their children and their neighbors and the accumulated decades of a life built on this flat, sky-broad Kansas ground. And she looked at the fire with its particular quality of light that does not change across years. And she thought about a woman who had come to this place with nothing and had been invisible to everyone at a gathering just like this one, and who had then become visible because one man had stood up and pointed to a seat beside him, and how everything in the world had hinged on that simple gesture. Simon was speaking with Thomas Tremain's son Daniel, who had taken over the Tremain farm after his father's death and was doing well with wheat. Me was somewhere in the circle of children with the authority of a 10-year-old who is used to managing situations. Gerald sat beside his father with the concentrated listening expression that would serve him well in whatever future he was moving toward. Thomas was asleep against Lydia's side, warm and heavy in the way of sleeping 4-year-olds, his weight a specific and beloved gravity. Simon turned from his conversation and looked at her, and she looked back, and something in that exchange contained the full weight of everything they had been and built and survived and chosen, and also the complete ease of two people who are home. "All right," he said. "Better than that," she said. He put his hand over hers on the bench, and the fire burned, and the October night was cold and bright, and the stars over Kansas were the same stars that had been there when Lydia Monroe stepped off a stage in 1882 with a carpetbag and a hard history and no allies in sight. But she was not that woman alone at the edge of the light anymore, and the distance between then and now was the measure of everything. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the full, actual life of a woman who had stayed and fought and opened herself, at great personal cost, to the possibility that one person's genuine goodness could change the entire landscape of what was possible. And she was grateful. Not the grateful of someone who is relieved to have survived, but the grateful of someone who is thoroughly and specifically glad to be exactly where they are, with exactly these people, on exactly this piece of flat Kansas earth, under these stars that had watched the whole of it unfold, and would go on turning overhead long after all the fires had burned to their beautiful, ordinary ash. The morning after the harvest gathering, when the children were fed and Simon had gone out with James early to look at the north pasture fencing, Lydia sat at the desk in the ranch house office where she had first sorted Simon's chaotic accounts 14 years ago, and she wrote a letter to Widow Hennessy, who had moved to her sister's home in Arkansas 2 years previous, but with whom she maintained a faithful correspondence. She told the widow about the gathering, about the children, about Simon's deal with the Kansas City buyer that had gone well, about Thomas sleeping through the end of the evening against her side with absolute trustfulness. She told the widow that she was happy. She said it directly, the way she said everything, without qualifying it or hedging it or making it smaller for politeness. She said, "I am happy, and I want you to know it, because you are one of the people who made it possible by being decent to me when it would have cost you nothing to be otherwise." She sealed the letter and addressed it and set it on the edge of the desk for the morning post, and then she sat for a moment in the office that smelled of paper and leather and the particular clean dust of the plains, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch house around her, the fire in the kitchen stove, me's voice somewhere upstairs in the authority of a child who has decided something must happen immediately, Thomas's response, which was as usual tranquil, the distant sound of Simon and James calling something to each other across the south pasture, the October wind moving across the land in its long, patient way. She was 39 years old in a county where she had arrived as an outsider, carrying other people's worst assumptions about her like a weight she had not agreed to carry. She had set the weight down. She had replaced it with the things she had actually chosen: the work, the land, the man who stood up at a fire, the children, the life that was entirely hers and entirely theirs, and entirely something worth the whole difficult journey of arriving at it. She picked up her pen and opened the account books because the accounts were due, and because she had always found something clarifying about the precision of numbers, and because the Double B's payroll did not arrange itself, and because she was Lydia Monroe Boone and she was, by every measure she trusted, exactly where she was supposed to be. The wind moved outside. The fire in the stove settled. The morning went on. The life went on. And it was good and it was real and it was hers.